The Degrees of Knowledge by Jacques Maritain. Appendix 2. On Analogy. Analoga proportionalitatis propriae, dicunter quorum nomen commune est, ratio vero significata, eadem secundum similitudinem, seu convenientiam proportionum, et in utroque formaliter et vera praesens. The sense in which the analog belongs intrinsically and formally to each of the analogates is purely and simply diverse, yet the same under a certain aspect, in that it implies like relations to terms that are alike, even though essentially different. Relations that are registered in the very nature of the analogical concept. The pages in Chapter 5 devoted to the analogy of being and the transcendentals are not an exposition, in forma, of the doctrine of analogy. They are simply an attempt to shed a little light on certain particularly important aspects of the doctrine from the point of view with which we are concerned, to wit, the critique of metaphysical knowledge. That is why we only retain the last of the diverse sorts of analogy recognized by logicians. Analogy of attribution, metaphorical analogy, analogy of proper proportionality. For this last one is metaphysical analogy in the highest sense of the word, and there is an advantage in dealing with it alone in order to work with a pure case. As Cajetan says, it alone constitutes a true analogy, the others being called by that name only in an improper manner. Moreover, if analogy of attribution is often mingled with analogy of proper proportionality, it is only in virtue of the analogy of proper proportionality that the analogy of attribution, in such mixed cases, permits us to attain attributes in things known analogically that are predicated of those things intrinsically and formally. Of itself, an analogy of attribution only permits us to attain a form found intrinsically in the prime analogate, in others extrinsically and by denomination. Now let us try to characterize these three kinds of analogy as definitely as possible. In analogy of attribution, when it functions in its pure state, without being linked up with an analogy of proper proportionality, one has to do with a concept which is univocal in itself. Concept number 1, healthy, said of a living organism, but which the mind uses analogically by transferring it to other subjects. Concept number 2, healthy, said of climate, in which case it designates something which is made known by its relation to the object of thought signified in itself by concept number 1. A climate is healthy because it is a cause of health, of the health of the organism. It is immediately evident that under these conditions, an analogy of attribution, when it is all by itself, does not enable us to attain the thing analogically known in accordance with what is properly signified by the concept. It enables us to do that only when it is linked with an analogy of proper proportionality. In such mixed cases, there is formally an analogy of proper proportionality and only virtually an analogy of attribution. In metaphorical analogy, one has to do with a concept which is univocal in itself. Concept number 1, eagle, said of a bird, in which the mind uses analogically by transferring it to other subjects. Concept number 2, eagle, said of an orator, wherein it designates something made known by the likeness between the relation which that subject, the orator, has to a certain term, sublime eloquence, and the relation which the object properly signified by concept number 1, the bird, has to another term, lofty flight. It is clear that under such conditions, metaphorical analogy, analogy of improper proportionality, never enables us, by itself, to attain the thing analogically known in accordance with what is properly signified by the concept. In analogy of proper proportionality, one has to do with a concept which is analogical in itself.
knowing, said of sense and intellect, being, said of the creature and of God, and which designates, in each of the subjects of which it is said, something made known by the likeness between the relations which one of these subjects, sense, has to the term, knowing, designated in it by that concept, on the one hand, and the relation which the other subject, intellect, has to that term, knowing, likewise designated in it by the same concept on the other hand. It is immediately evident that under these conditions, the concept being in that case analogous of itself, an analogy of proper proportionality does enable us to attain the thing analogically known, in accordance with what is properly signified by the concept. In this case, what is signified by the concept, inasmuch as it is one, even though it is so only in a unity of proportionality, is intrinsically and formally in each of the analogates.
Thus, the essential difference between analogy of proper proportionality and the other two becomes quite apparent. When Cajetan, discussing analogy of proper proportionality, writes that analogical concepts are concepts that are first univocal and then made analogical, that does not mean that we make something analogical which was not so in itself from the first, but rather that the mind, after having first used such concepts univocally and without realizing that they were analogical, later discovers that they are really analogical. But they were analogical from the very outset. They are analogical of themselves. That is why an analogical concept, with an analogy of proper proportionality, is one in a certain respect, in a unity of proportionality, whereas an analogy of attribution, in metaphorical analogy, there is not even that kind of imperfect unity. The concept of healthy, denoting a quality of the climate, and the concept healthy, as referred to the organism, are two different concepts. The first connotes the second, and results from transferring the second to a subject to which it does not belong, as far as the thing it properly signifies is concerned.
The question of analogy has given rise to numerous studies. In this place, we mention only those to which the interpretation we deem authentically Thomistic, and which is taken for granted in the reflections we have set forth in our text, can in some way be referred as to its source. As regards the principal analogates, we share the opinion that in analogy of attribution, there is a principal analogate, whose notion is included in that of all the other analogates. All those analogates are only made known through the diverse relations they have to the supreme analogate. When the analogy of attribution is in its pure state, it is a concept which is univocal in itself, but used analogically by the mind. The same is not the case in analogy of proper proportionality. In this case, the supreme analogate is the one of which the analogous term is said primarily in itself, not in relation to us. Uncreated being is the supreme analogate of being. Moreover, its notion is not included in the notion of the other analogates. On the other hand, we feel that there has not been sufficient use of the remark that in mixed cases in which analogy of attribution and analogy of proportionality are linked together, analogy of attribution is only virtual. When from the existence of created being, we conclude to the existence of its uncreated cause, we are already bringing the analogy of proper proportionality into play. For such a reasoning implies that the notion of cause is itself analogous by an analogy of proper proportionality. And in addition, it implies that the uncreated being to which the reasoning concludes, and the created being from which it sets out, are called by the same name, being. Not only because the first is the cause of the second, but because what is signified by the concept is found in both according to a likeness of proportions. From the fact that the relation of causality lies at the basis of analogy of attribution, between effect and cause. It does not follow that analogy of attribution is formally used each time. The path of causality is followed to establish the existence of the source of created perfections.